Implementing Dynamic Access Control. Thus far in the course, we've seen Microsoft tweak and tune many core features of Windows Server that have been around at least since the previous version, Windows Server 2008 R2. In this nugget, we examine a brand new technology that, in my opinion, turns a lot of things on their heads, particularly how we look at file permissions. You, I'm sure, are used to shared folder and NTFS permissions. They can be relatively inflexible. Let's face it, they can be very inflexible as your enterprise gets larger and larger, and as you have more and more granular requirements to meet in terms of an organizational security policy or perhaps compliance with laws. So our goals for this nugget are to understand dynamic access control, also abbreviated to DAC. I'm going to call it DAC a lot in this nugget. There are quite a few moving parts to dynamic access control, so bear with me. The good news from an adult education standpoint, as you know, I'm a big proponent of adult education and repetition as a means to mastery. We're by definition going to have to bring back some of the stuff we did in the previous nugget on File Server Resource Manager, because as you start to put these parts together, what are claims and how are they used in DAC? How do we classify folders, which is where the integration with the previous nugget comes in? What central access policy is? Basically, it ties together claims and folder classifications for the purpose of auditing or creating conditional access lists. We're going to revisit the subject of access denied assistance and actually see it in action during our demo today. And like I said, DAC factors into auditing. There's some really nice enhancements to the auditing infrastructure in Windows Server 2012 as well. We have a lot of exciting ground to cover, so let's waste no more time and let's get into it. Understanding dynamic access control. As I alluded to in the opening slide of this nugget, Dynamic Access Control is a brand new feature in Windows Server 2012 that completely revamps the way that we look at file authorization and accounting. I've mentioned this before. You're bound to see it sooner or later if you haven't already. The AAA security model is not tied to Microsoft. It's pretty vendor neutral, actually. It's a way of looking at security with three main touch points. The first one being authentication, that is validating a user's credentials and determining that they are in fact a legitimate user in your organization. The second A stands for authorization. What this means is, given an authenticated security principal, in Active Directory domain services, we know that security principals can be users as well as computers. What are the limits of that security principal's access to resources in the domain? And the third A stands for accounting. And now more than ever before, I know I mentioned compliance before, and I'm sure I'll mention it again as we go through the nugget, but the fact of the matter is, many shops are hit hard with compliance requirements. Quite a few of my friends work in healthcare. Nashville, Tennessee is a pretty big city for healthcare and hospital management. Those IT folks are under tremendous strictures in terms of documenting that they are in fact encrypting and storing patient record data in a way that ensures confidentiality and secure access and privacy for those customers. So it's more than just a good idea to ensure that we have all three of these A's covered, including auditing, which is going to be our audit trail or our record of our activities. Now, given that background, what Dynamic Access Control is specifically is a new access control method for file system resources, so we're talking about our Windows Server 2012 file servers, that provides three main functions. One is access control, so specific authorization to resources. You've heard of least privilege. We want to make sure that only folks who are genuinely authorized to view files and make changes to files are allowed to do so. Anybody else should be denied across the board. We also have auditing, which, as I alluded to in the opening of this nugget, is a new feature that ties dynamic access control with traditional Windows auditing. You'll see how that works in more detail later. And then we have our friend file classification infrastructure from the previous nugget. Now, it's important to know, friends, that dynamic access control functions as a layer on top of your existing NTFS and shared folder permissions. Please note that, double underline, DAC does not replace your traditional permission structure. It acts as an overlay you're not going to be able to grant users any more permissions than they already have through that combination of NTFS and share permissions. Now, just by way of quick review, you'll recall that permissions, that is to say, shared folder permissions that apply only to, well, shared folders, and NTFS permissions, which apply security access control lists to both folders and files, are cumulative individually. That is, if an individual belongs to two groups and you've given NTFS modify to one group and NTFS read to another group, then the user would inherit both of those permissions and therefore be able to modify files. Same thing works within share permissions. Now, when we combine share folder permissions with NTFS, the effective permission is the most restrictive permission, such that if we had share read for authenticated users, not a good idea. And then at the NTFS level for files within that shared folder, if we granted even full control, the user's effective permission would still be read. Thus, best practice is to set your share permissions wide open. Authenticated users, full control, or even everyone full control, and then use NTFS to hone down the effective permissions of your users. Now, on top of that, we have DAC. Now, you might think, well, aren't we throwing more complexity? I'm already a beleaguered Windows Systems Administrator. We don't have enough staff on hand as it is, and now you're asking me to learn this new access control method that doesn't even replace what we had, but it goes on top of it. Well, I think you're going to see sooner rather than later that DAC provides us with many, many benefits that you otherwise could never get with just NTFS permissions. Specifically, we have the ability to protect sensitive information. Not only protect it in terms of just standard permissions, you can read, you can't read, you can write, you can't write, but we can pipeline data into RMS, Active Directory Rights Management Services, which we'll talk about later in the course in detail, and provide honest-to-goodness encryption and application-specific restrictions to data. We also can keep in compliance analysis, a little spelling glitch there I want to catch off the way, provides much more granular data analysis. You'll see that in terms of the auditing capabilities with DAC. And we have this access denied remediation, which is an excellent feature that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, it gets complicated, of course, when we have new technologies because there's the question of backward compatibility. Windows 7 can participate in DAC inasmuch as it's the file server, and as long as your file server is running an appropriate version of Windows, it can take care of the claims lookup along with your domain controller, Kerberos v5 specifically. Now, when we get into things like access denied remediation, that will only work with Windows 8. To simplify things, friends, I'm assuming we're talking Windows Server 2012 on the server side and Windows 8 on the client, and you can always assume that safely for your 7412 certification exam success. Now, let me give you a practical example of dynamic access control so you can see how it differs from traditional NTFS permissions. Let's say we have a fictional scenario in which we have file system resources that are eyes only for certain users. Now, traditionally, we have our users broken out into global groups, and then we populate those global groups into domain local groups, which in turn have some level of access. It could be modify for folders, it could be change for files, etc. That's not particularly granular. You may have everybody in the accounting department, irrespective of whether they're located in Indianapolis or Nashville, you see. In my example I'm giving here, let's say our business need is for Nashville campus files that are classified as confidential, allow read-write access only from Nashville users who work in the RD department. So we can still keep our Active Directory groups the way that we want to, and we won't break anything. We can keep all of that static. But by overlaying this extra layer of access protection, specifically deploying what's called a central access policy, we can grant that level of granularity to those resources. Now, what that looks like technically is we have what are called claims configured in Active Directory domain services that populate or pull Active Directory schema attributes from our user and computer accounts. In this case, this central access policy is looking for user accounts whose location is Nashville and their department is RD. Anybody who doesn't match both of those gets rejected and doesn't get access. On the other side, the resource properties are the classification tags for folders and files. And here again, the central access policy is only going to affect those files that have been tagged Campus Nashville Classification Confidential. You see how that works? That's a highly granular level of access, I think you'd agree. Now, let's spend a little bit of time going into depth about each of those constituent parts and pieces. What are claims? First of all, even before we talk about claims, what is identity? And yet, to foreshadow, we'll be dealing with Active Directory Federation services in great detail later in the course, so we'll revisit the subject of identity. But for now, simply know that for our purposes, identity refers to published information about an entity from a trusted data store. And that word trust becomes particularly important when we're talking about Active Directory Federation services. For our purposes today, we can assume that the trusted data source is Active Directory itself, and that this published info refer to Active Directory schema properties for user and computer accounts. So specifically, claims are simply statements made about users and devices in ADDS. Another Win8 gotcha, only Windows 8 supports device claims. And as you know, schema attributes have a function very similar to columns in a database table. You have a name, you have a data type that constrains the type of data that can fit into that particular attribute. And with DAC, as you'll see, you can even pre-populate suggested values. So for departments, you can pre-populate department names in your organization, and then what that does in essence is cut down on user error or operator error through mistyping or data entry problems. Now, claims relies upon Kerberos v5 and also another related technology called Kerberos armoring. In fact, a prerequisite to deploying DAC is that you extend your Active Directory schema. Don't worry, you don't have to do anything with LDP or the schema management snap-in. You can do it through group policy. But in effect, what we're doing is extending our user account and computer accounts access tokens. Normally, when a user is authenticated, they carry with them, so to speak, as they access resources in your domain, their own SID for the identity itself, the user account, the computer account, any group SIDs to which they belong. That's normal. Once we've done this extension, claims information comes along for the ride. And claims get presented for authentication and authorization just like the SID and the password information, just like the SID information does. So claims is what you configure for your user population. You determine what attributes are important for my users and computers that would fit into dynamic access control. The other side of the coin is your shared folder infrastructure, and that's where we have resource properties and resource property lists. Resource properties are metadata tags that are stored in Active Directory, available globally and ingestible by your file servers. Now, you'll remember the demo from the previous nugget. I showed you that. We went into File Server Resource Manager, and when I showed you the classification properties, there were a few I had in there from my own work that were classified as global. Those came from DAC. And I mentioned a best practice is if you're going to be going into this whole hog in terms of FCI and or DAC, I would define my resource properties globally instead of doing it on a server-by-server basis. And similar to Active Directory schema attributes, properties are name and data pairs, and they support multiple data types. So we have the ability to do yes, no, Boolean sort of logic. We also can do single response from a group. We have multiple select, a lot of flexibility. You'll see that in the demo. And once you've done that, actually the resource properties are individual atomic units. You roll those up into a resource property list and then fly those out to your file servers. And once you've deployed your resource property list or lists to your file servers, you'll find the classification tag on file system resources where you can manually assign tags, which I wouldn't recommend. It's a lot of work if you have anything more than a very small amount of files and folders. Or the better way is to use FSRM, which again we learned about in the previous nugget and we'll practice with today. We can create classification rules and run these on a schedule and even take action on files depending upon how they're classified. As an example, we can configure FSRM to scour directories for files containing Social Security number strings. I'm actually going to include that in the demo so you can see how the regular expression stuff works. When it finds those files, we can tag or classify them, move them to another location, and then the cherry on top of the proverbial sundae, apply RMS encryption. Isn't that cool? Alrighty then, so we have the claims, we have the resource properties. The thing that ties them together is the Central Access Policy, or CAP. A CAP is an object, an Active Directory object, that consists of one or more individual central access rules, or I guess we could call them CARs if we want to do a cute acronym here. And what a central access rule is, in turn, is one or more statements of conditional logic to scope access and permissions. And as you'll see in the demo, you first define target resources. This is going to scope the file system resources that will be stamped with your central access policy. Once you've scoped out your file system resources, you then create your conditional statement. And that statement can use and or, the logical comparison stuff. And you can pull in claims, location is Nashville, department is RD, resource properties, classification equals confidential, and so forth. And then create a traditional access control list based on those results. You see? Once you've finished creating your CAP, you then deploy it to your enterprise, and it becomes available on your file servers for assignment to specific folders. So there is an extra step. You have to go to the properties of the folder and plug in the central access policy that you want to use. What's awesome about that breakdown between the resource property and the resource property list and the central access rule and the central access policy is that you can mix and match and create several of each type using different rules and using different resource properties, and then deploy them on a per server or per share basis. Finally, when we configure our central access policy, you're probably thinking, well, boy, there's plenty of room for error here. What if I build one of these things, unleash it to my users, and then I get inundated with calls, users hopping mad because they can't access files that they could access just a few minutes earlier? You can actually do a somewhat similar thing to what we have in group policy. Remember resultant set of policy? Or in PowerShell, you can do what if scenarios. We can create permission lists and stage them or actually release them. They're called proposed permissions or current permissions. If we do proposed permissions, then what happens is as your users access your central access policy protected folders, instead of the users getting hit with access denied all the time, we're just generating particular event IDs that you can monitor for a while to see if there are any problems, tweak, identify, resolve, and then when you're ready, you can flip the switch and make those permissions live. Our final whiteboard before our demo: access denied assistance and auditing options. I mentioned before that access denied assistance is available only for your Windows 8 clients, which I'm sure is a big bummer to those of you who aren't ready to move your users to Windows 8, because it's really a great benefit. As you see down below, this is a sample screenshot. When a user attempts to access a resource on your network that's protected, or at the very least is managed through FSRM, the user can see, and this is all customizable. The copy that you see in the message box is all customizable. In fact, we saw that a little bit in the previous nugget. So the user can understand exactly why they're getting the error message. I mean, nothing is more frustrating to an administrator, much less the end user, when they receive just access denied, or even worse, a cryptic message that just says, this resource can't be reached. You know, it's not helpful at all. So we can figuratively pat the hand of the end user with the text and even give them one-click access to ask the administrator and or the file owner for help. And that's the other benefit. The administrator who receives the notification can take a look at detailed access metadata, which we need. We need that background info to be able to identify quickly and easily why the user was denied access, and then you can make whatever remediation you need to. Now, with respect to auditing, traditionally, in my experience anyway, object access auditing has been, well, how can I be charitable here? Inflexible might be the best way I can say it. We can turn on success and/or failure auditing for objects, and even do so globally as a result of Windows Server 2008 R2. But there's the problem of receiving a flood of event log messages, what's meaningful and what's not, and then parsing through that flood to get down to the few key messages. The feedback historically hasn't been particularly helpful. So what the Windows team did here is allow us, number one, to create conditional-based auditing. Now, it does take some getting used to, and I guarantee you'll go through this learning curve as you're using DAC and creating your conditional access lists. But once you start to see the magic and the power there, you'll be able to start thinking in your mind how you might want to structure an audit policy using those same conditions. That will instantly reduce the flood of event messages you're getting, and you should have a much bigger bang for your buck as far as high value results. Now, to add on to that in Windows Server 2012 we now have more detailed feedback in those messages. So we can see file attribute changes. We can see reason for access metadata. This is meant, and it does, I think, save us administrators a lot of time that we otherwise don't have looking up particular event IDs online when you've got the heat on trying to get a fix to a particular problem. Now that I've whet your appetite, let's fire up our servers and get started with our demonstration. Hi there, friends, and welcome to this demonstration of Dynamic Access Control in Windows Server 2012. We have many things to do in this demo, so if you feel I'm moving a bit too quickly, you have a few options. One, write me and tell me about it. You know my email address. I always love to hear from my students. Your feedback shapes the way in which I design and deliver these courses for CBT Nuggets. Two, be aware that as a CBT Nuggets member, you have the ability to alter the playback speed to suit your particular learning needs. And number three, don't feel bad about pausing and rewinding to replay certain sections of a nugget if you need to see a procedure done more than once. There's no shame in that. Now, without any further ado, let me show you our environment. We have 3 boxes in the nuggetlab.com domain. HVNugget 1 is our domain controller. HVNugget 2 is our file server. And CleanNugget 1 is a Windows 8 Enterprise Edition box that's a member of the domain. Ignore this Windows Server 2012 here from my BG info. I typed that in by hand. It's a mistake. This is actually a Windows 8 box, as you can see in the lower right corner of the screen. Now, we're going to set Dynamic Access Control in a scenario to make it more understandable and relatable to us Windows systems administrators. The story thus far is this. On HVNugget 2, we have a share called Human Resources that contains documents that are relevant to the Human Resources Department. To that point, on HVNugget 2, here is that share. You'll see we have several text files, 3 employee files, a policies, and a procedures document, and I've created a subfolder called PII. That stands for Personally Identifiable Information. Now, why is that relevant? It's just that point, actually. Because some of those files in that share contain social security numbers, we want to take some operations on those files to ensure compliance and top security. First, we want to identify the files that contain the social security number data. We want to move them into the PI folder, and we want to ensure that not only HR employees can see those files, but only a subset of the HR department, managers, should have access to those files. We want to accomplish this using least administrative effort. So our goals in a nutshell: we need to classify the data appropriately, we need to do a file operation to transfer files around, we need to guarantee least privilege access to those files, and we also want to turn on auditing so we can notice both successful and failed attempts to get to those files. It's a lot of work, isn't it? But we're going to take it one step at a time. Our first step, of course, is to configure claims. Now, I say of course as if it's obvious. Please don't think it is necessarily. We're going to do this on our domain controller through the Active Directory Administrative Center. My favorite way to do this, if I already have an administrative PowerShell window up, is to just type DSAC. You'll recall that DSA.MSC is the name of the Active Directory Users and Computers console. More and more, we're seeing technologies that can only be performed within Administrative Center. So please start to migrate over to it from ADUC if you haven't already done so. And when we think about claims, we want to take a look at one of our users. I'll just grab Heather Kolb, who's a fictional user at Nugget Lab, and we want to look at the Active Directory attributes that are exposed. Specifically, I want you to see here her job title, which is associate, her department, which is human resources, and her company. So in determining claims, you need to look at these and figure out A, which properties are relevant for the claims, and then, just as importantly, what are the actual Active Directory schema attribute names for these user-friendly properties. Now, we want to filter on HR employees as well as managers. So we're actually looking for both of these, job title and department. And there's a few different ways to get to that. If we come down to the extensions area, we have the attribute editor shown by default. You'll note that in Active Directory users and computers, you need to enable advanced features to see this. And if I type T, I can come down to title. We can verify that this is in fact the name of the attribute because you see that associate's already popped in there. Now as far as department goes, that's easy enough too, department. Now you'll find that some of the attribute names are fairly non-descriptive. Look at this, C, what does that mean? You know, CO, what's that? TechNet has a reference where you can look up attributes if you're not finding enough detail within the interface. Now, you'll notice here in Active Directory Administrative Center, I have List View and Tree View. I find Tree View to be more useful to quickly navigate amongst your objects here. Let me collapse my domain and expand Dynamic Access Control. We'll go into claim types. There are no claim types given to us by default. By contrast, resource properties, Microsoft gives us a bunch of those out of the box. I have my filter turned on here, so let me turn that off. Back to claim types, we can come over to the Tasks pane, New Claim Type, to bring it up. And here's what we want to do. We want to filter through our attribute list. We'll recall that department is what we're interested in. I'll just do a search for DEPAR. Make sure that it's selected. I'm going to capitalize D because this is actually the display name, the user-friendly name. We determine whether this is a user or a computer attribute. We're going to do user in this case. Protect from accidental deletions, pretty useful. It's actually enabled by default. And then, as I said before, suggested values are helpful to avoid data entry errors. So I'm going to supply some values here by clicking Add, and we're going to add a value of human resources. Click OK. And we'll also add another one for marketing. We can click OK, and we now see that we have a new claim type. And by the way, let me select it and press delete. It asks us, are you sure you want to do this? You'll note that because we have that protection turned on, even though I'm logged on as a domain admin, it tells me I don't have sufficient credentials. So that's just a way to doubly protect Active Directory objects. Let's right-click in the window, come to New Claim Type, and the other one we're interested in, you'll recall, is Title. So I'll select that, not to be confused with Personal Title. I'll capitalize the user-friendly version, and I'm also going to provide some suggested values here. We know that associate is 1. We want to be really standardized with how you're filling data. A problem I've had in the past is if you have multiple administrators creating user accounts, you might introduce misspellings or other inconsistencies. It's not cool to do that. We're going to have manager and associate be our two suggested values. We'll click OK. And that's it. These are now globally available properties that we can get to on our file server in File Server Resource Manager. While we're here, actually, let me quickly dip into my Nugget Lab domain, right-click the object, and let's quickly create a new organizational unit called File Servers. Click OK to come out of there. And we're going to go ahead and move our file server, HVNugget2. We're going to right-click and move that guy into our File Servers organizational unit. And the reason we're doing that, of course, is to scope group policy a little bit later. Now, getting right into the next step, let's go into resource properties. Microsoft gives us a handful of these out of the box. It's worth your while to take a look at these, friends, and just get a feel for how they're structured. For instance, we have a built-in resource property called confidentiality, and if I open it up, this is not tied to a schema attribute. This is a display name, a value type, and suggested values. There's plenty of data types to choose from. This one is an ordered list, and you'll notice that Microsoft gives us low, moderate, and high as our defaults. They're eminently customizable, though. You'll also notice that all of these built-in properties are, by default, disabled. If I want to enable it, I can right-click and choose Enable, and now that guy or that property will be available once I push him out. The only resource property we're concerned with in this simple example is whether or not a file contains PII, or personally identifiable information. So let's go to New Resource Property, and I'll call this easily enough PII, and we'll take a look at our data types. Single value choice, yes, no, etc. I'm going to choose yes, no. That's pretty easy here. For a binary property like yes, no, the suggested values area is disabled. By contrast, if you had a single valued choice, you'll notice that we can in fact create a pick list from which we can choose when we're tagging. But yes, no, I think will work here. Let me actually make sure I select that, and then we click OK. And you'll notice if we scroll through, Pi is enabled by default. Microsoft assumes that that's the case because we created it ourselves. Now, the resource property list is what's deployable, not the resource property itself. So we can right-click and go to Resource Property List, and I'll call this PII Resource Prop List. And what we do here is simply click Add, and we can select any enabled properties. So I'm going to filter by P, select my PII, and just for grins, I think the other one I had enabled was, I actually forgot. Let me OK out of here, verify that the list is valid, and let's come back to Resource Properties. Confidentiality I enabled. So for grins, let's just add that. We can always come back and make changes to these resource property lists. We'll bring confidentiality over, click OK. And so now by deploying this resource property list to our file server, the file server will now be able to classify using those resource properties. With that, let's now shift our focus to our file server, HVNugget2, and there's our human resources share. I actually haven't shared it yet, so let's do that now by visiting Properties, configuring Advanced Sharing, sharing the folder, and setting permissions wide open, everyone full control. We'll go over to Security. We'll edit the permissions list. It looks like our domain users have read. Let's give them modify at this level. Let's also check on Creator to bring in the creator owner special identity to give that guy full control. So folks who put their own files or create their own files will have full control. Now you might be thinking, aren't you being dangerously wild with your permissions, Tim? Not really, because that's what the beauty of dynamic access control gives us. In FSRM on HVNugget2, we can expand our classification properties node to see whether that the new resource property list has been picked up. Sure enough, as you can see, and I'll quick sort by scope, we have our two global properties that come to us by means of Active Directory. Now, if for some reason you don't find those properties available, what you'll want to do is run a manual synchronization of those properties. You can do that on your file server by running update FSRM classification property definition, and that's a very quick commandlet and will update those properties. Now we're going to create a classification rule that looks for social security numbers. I'll call the rule name SSNPI. We're going to scope it for user files that are located on our E drive Human Resources folder. For classification, we're going to do content classifier to drill into that content, and we're going to set the pi to yes such that, let's configure here, where our regular expression is that. And that is this string right here, which looks for pattern matches on social security number values. 3 digits, hyphen, 2 digits, hyphen, 4 digits. And we're looking for at least one occurrence in there. Let's click OK. OK. We'll run it right now, and we'll wait for it to complete. According to the classification rule, it tagged employee1.txt from eHuman Resources. Let's browse to that location and check on our classification. There's employee1. If we go into the file, sure enough, we do see that pattern. Employee2 also has that pattern, but it's not matching what you would expect for social security numbers. So I'm going to correct that, and we can run the job again. Remember that one of the parameters is whether you want to merge or replace your existing classification. And sure enough, it got employee2 that time. And we can verify that by right-clicking, going to Properties, Classification tab, and we see pi is set to yes. Employee3 doesn't actually have that, so we can explicitly tag this. This is how we would manually tag, by the way. by selecting the appropriate resource property and assigning a value to it. Okay, so I've shown you how to automatically classify, how to manually classify. We want to take the files that do contain sensitive data and put them into the PI folder automagically. And to do that, you'll remember we need a file management task for that. I'll call this move PI. We're going to again scope user files in the E Human Resources shared folder. We'll call this file expiration and we'll move them to Human Resources PI. I won't worry about notifications. I'll leave the reports alone. The property conditions I'll leave blank. And for schedule, I'll just say weekly. Now, I made a mistake. It tells us here that the expiration directory cannot be within the file management scope. So I'm going to need to move this guy. Let's select the folder. I'll cut it and we'll put it in the root of E instead. So we can easily fix that by adjusting our action path. And I'm using expiration here just for simplicity's sake, but you could do this just as well with a custom job. We'll leave the reports at their default. For condition, we're going to add in a condition such that the PI property is equal to yes. So we want to be careful to narrowly scope this out. We'll do a weekly schedule by default, click OK. Now, not to be anticlimactic, but I'm actually not going to run this because I want those files to stay in their current share location so we can test access. But regardless, that's how it works at any rate. You'll recall that we have some more work to do on our domain controller. Specifically, we need to create our central access rule and our central access policy. So let's go ahead and create our central access rule, where we'll call this PI HR Manager. And our target resources, we're going to click Edit and then add a condition such that we're looking for all files where the resource PI equals the value yes, where it does contain personalized information. Now note that you can do really broad scoping here with exists or not exists. Look for files that do or don't have a particular resource property. You don't have to do equals. It depends upon your business logic. You'll see that the conditional expression gets populated in there. Now for permissions, this is where we can do either proposed staged permissions or current. We're going to do current permissions and click Edit. This is our discretionary access control list. We're going to add, click Select a Principal and bring in authenticated users. That's Microsoft's suggestion. And then we can allow whatever we want. I'll say modify to, again, we have a condition. And here we're going to say that the user's department needs to be human resources. And then we're going to add a condition. You can do and or. The user's title has to be manager, you see? That's how we do conditional logic. Let's click OK, and you'll see that we have authenticated users with a conditional expression, conditions. Click OK and OK. Let's go to Central Access Policies, right-click, New Central Access Policies. I'll call this PI-HR-Manager Policy, or I'll call it CAR for Central Access Policy. And then for the rules, click Add. We have just the one, so we'll bring it over and click OK, and click OK. So there you have it. We're pretty much done with Active Directory Administrative Center for now. We now need to quickly configure Group Policy in a couple of different locations, actually. First, we have to enable Kerberos armoring for our domain controllers. I already have the GPMC up, and I'm going to scope this guy at the default domain controllers policy level. We'll edit the policy, navigate to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, System, KDC, and for the policy KDC support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring, we're going to enable that and select Supported from the options list. Unfortunately, we're not yet finished. In the same path for Kerberos, we have Kerberos client support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring. Can't do that here in domain controllers, so what we'll do is close out of that and edit the default domain policy, find the same path, and let's enable it here for clients. You following me so far? So we've taken care of the domain controller Kerberos stuff, we've just configured client Kerberos, and now finally let's publish our central access policy to my HVNugget 2 file server. And to do that, I'm going to create a GPO and link it to that OU. I'll call this DAC settings. And in that group policy, the relevant path is Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, File System, Central Access Policy. We want to right-click this guy and select Manage Central Access Policies from the shortcut menu. We have just the one defined. We'll add it in and click OK. While we're here, as a final step, we're going to configure our Advanced Audit Policy configuration. Remember that normally what we do is in audit policy here, we can do object access, which is in a way the on-off switch on a particular server or whoever you're scoping the GPO for. And then normally we would go to particular folders and enable what's called a system access control list to look for specific stuff. As of Windows Server 2008 R2, we have global object access auditing, and we also have just expanded audit policies here that give us much more information. And even more to the point, if we expand global object access auditing and look at the file system, you'll remember that this allows us to deploy those system access control lists on an entire server instead of you're having to do it on a per share basis. So what we can do is monitor anybody. I'll call this everyone. And we're going to monitor all permissions, but check this out. We're going to add a condition such that the resource of pi equals value yes. So we're going to specifically monitor accesses to our personally identifiable information, just in one fell swoop. That's global object access auditing. Cool. So I believe we're done with group policy, fortunately. So let's blast that out on our domain controller by running gp-update force. And let's navigate now back to hvnugget 2. Let's go back to human resources, my shared folder, and make sure that our files are still there and they're still classified appropriately. Yep, it looks like they are. You might need to run a GP update on the file server. So let's examine the properties of human resources. Go to the Security tab and click Advanced. And we now have an extra tab that we didn't have before for Central Policy. Note also we can expand any resource properties that have been configured inside that folder or for that resource. For now, let's go under Central Policy, click Change, and we can make that car available. And it tells us which rules apply. And if we expand it even more, it gives us the access control list. I didn't mean to actually leave there. What we can do before we test user access specifically is that there's actually a built-in resultant set of policy tool. That's this effective access tab where we can look up a user, for instance, Ed Dennis, who's one of my sample users. You can optionally bring in group memberships and claims. Otherwise, you can view effective access and see what the user should be able to do on a folder or file basis. Now, this guy at the folder level, he's able to get in just by means of NTFS and share permissions. Now, if we go to a file in that folder, such as a personally identifiable information file, we can do the same thing, Advanced Effective Access, select User, and when we view his effective access, we can see how his access is scoped by means of both file permissions and central accesses. And if you have a problem, like for instance, let's do this again, but with a user who's not a manager. I have a user named Heather Kolb who's in human resources, but she's an associate, not a manager. We can see she has no access at all by means of our central access rule. And then just as a final cherry on top, let's go to our Windows 8 box. Let's see, I am logged on as Heather Kolb here, hvnugget 2, human resources. She sees human resource files, and policies, for instance, opens up just fine because she's got the correct NTFS permissions. But if we go to employee 1, we get a simple access is denied error, which isn't particularly useful. And it reminds me of one more thing I forgot to show you. I knew there's always one more thing, right? Let's go back to hvnugget 1, our domain controller, open up our GPMC, and let's quickly do access denied remediation. And if we open our group policy for our file server, my DAC settings group policy, for instance, and navigate to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Template, System, Access Denied Assistance, we can configure the policy here. Now, yes, we can do access denied assistance on the file server in FSRM, but doing it in group policy enables you to standardize access denied across all your servers. And if we go into Customize Message for Access Denied Errors, we can enable the policy. This is a custom message. Enable users to request assistance, and then if we scroll down, we can email recipients, folder owner, file server administrator, including claims data and specifics. So let's enable that and run a GP update on all affected machines. And so now when Heather tries to access that resource, she'll see a much more user-friendly message. Implementing Dynamic Access Control Review. I hope that you're as jazzed about DAC as I am. Whenever you're confronted with a new technology, if you're anything like me, at first there's just the overwhelm factor. I have all this new information to learn. And if you're preparing for the 412 exam, the heat is really on. You have to understand this in order to pass your exam. once you get past the initial overwhelm and start to fall into a learning curve, the logic of this stuff comes to the forefront, and you, I hope, if you're like me, begin to see real business value in this. DAC is not one of those shiny object type of technologies. It can very well form the core of your authorization strategy for your Windows file servers. So looking back at our bullet list, you now should have a good understanding of DAC's purpose and its benefits in business. You also, very importantly, understand the moving parts in the technology. We have the claims, user claims, device claims. Windows 8 is the only client OS that can do device claims, etc. We understand classifying folders, how we can do that within DAC and make global properties, or with FSRM we can dynamically scour and tag. We understand the central access rule, the central access policy, how those get made available to our file servers. We know how to customize access denied assistant messages to help our users when they do run into problems, and we understand the auditing enhancements with conditional logic and giving us more information with regard to user logons and object access. Good stuff here. Congratulations for hanging in, friends. You're doing great. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.